We've now put together an implementation for npm run start and npm run test. It's now time to think about how we're going to treat our Docker container in a production environment where we're supposed to eventually be running npm run build. I want you to remember that npm run build is going to build a production version of the application. Essentially, it takes all the JavaScript files, processes them all together, puts them all together into a single file, and then spits it out to a folder on your hard drive. And this is actually a pretty important distinction because it really changes the mechanics behind how our application is served up in a development and production environment. Let me show you a diagram or two to help you understand why. Okay, so this is a diagram of how our application runs in a development environment. Inside of our web container, we have a development server. Whenever our browser makes a request to port 3000 on localhost, it's really making a request to that dev server. The development server then takes a index.html file, a main.js file, or some otherwise JavaScript file, and sends it back over to the browser. So the development server is 100% required in the development environment. It's what facilitates processing all that JavaScript and then eventually serving it up to the browser. Now again, when we move over to the production environment, this dev server falls away. It just does not exist. We instead run npm run build one time, and that gives us essentially that index.html file and the main.js file that we need to somehow communicate down to our user's browser. As a quick aside, this development server falls away because it's really not appropriate to be running in a production environment. It has a ton of processing power inside of it dedicated to processing these JavaScript files that we're putting together. And that's something that we do not need to do when we are running in production because we're no longer making any changes to the JavaScript code of our project. So what we need for our production environment is some type of server here whose sole purpose is going to be to respond to browser requests with that index.html file and some random JavaScript file that contains all the React application code. So we need to essentially put something together here that's just going to take incoming requests and respond to them with those different files. To solve this, we're going to be making use of a server called Nginx. Nginx is an extremely popular web server. It doesn't have a lot of logic tied to it. It's really just about taking incoming traffic and somehow routing it or somehow responding to it with some static files, which is exactly what you and I are going to use it for. So we are going to create a separate Docker file that is going to create a production version of our web container. This production version of the web container is going to start up an Nginx instance, and we're going to use that Nginx server to to serve up our index.html and that main.js file. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to start putting together the Docker file that is going to make the production version of our web container.